All right, everybody, welcome back to Vuln Vibes. Glad to have you back with us.
Yes.
Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on something that sounds a little bit on the technical side,
A little bit, yeah.
but I think we can make it a little bit fun. We're going to be talking about SQL injection vulnerability
Right.
in SAP NetWeaver AS,
Yeah.
specifically on systems that are using Informix databases.
Yep.
And, if you've been following along with the show for a while,
Yeah.
you know what SQL injection is,
Yeah.
and you know that it's dangerous.
Absolutely.
But this one's a little different. This one's kind of a little bit more serious.
This one's a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. So before we get into the specifics of how this actually works and all that, can you maybe give us a little bit of a refresher on what SQL injection is?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
why it's dangerous?
Absolutely.
Like for somebody who's maybe new to the show, who's never heard this before.
So, SQL injection is basically a way to manipulate a database
Okay.
by injecting malicious code into data that's being sent to the database. So it's like, imagine you have a web application
Right.
that has a login form.
Okay.
And that login form takes your username and password and sends it to the database to verify if you are a valid user.
Right.
But if that web application doesn't properly validate the input,
Right.
an attacker can inject some malicious SQL code into that username or password field. And that code will then be executed by the database.
So like if I have a login form
Yeah.
and it says like, username colon,
Right.
and then a box for me to type my username, I could, instead of typing my username,
Yeah.
type some SQL code in there.
Right. And if it's not validating it, it'll just send that right through to the database.
And then all of a sudden the database is running my code instead of
Exactly.
doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And you can do all sorts of things with that.
Okay.
You can read data from the database. You can modify data. You can even delete data.
Okay. So that's
Ew.
obviously pretty bad.
It's pretty serious stuff, yeah.
So then how does this relate to this vulnerability that we're talking about today?
So in this specific vulnerability in ST NetWeaver AS,
Okay.
there are certain remote function calls,
Okay.
or RFCs, that are enabled.
Okay.
And these RFCs allow you to interact with the database,
Right.
but they don't properly validate the input.
Okay.
So an attacker can send a malicious RFC
Okay.
with some SQL code injected into it, and that code will then be executed by the database.
Okay.
And in this specific case, we're talking about Informix databases.
Right.
So if you're running SAP NetWeaver AS
Yeah.
on an Informix database, you are particularly vulnerable to this attack.
So this is like, for folks who are maybe running other kinds of databases, maybe they don't need to worry as much.
They might not be as vulnerable, but if you're running Informix,
Okay.
you definitely need to pay attention to this.
Okay, so let's get into a little bit more of the technical details here.
Sure.
So what are some of the ways that an attacker could actually exploit this vulnerability?
So there are a few different ways.
Okay.
One way is through a vulnerable function called check dbad bad batch.
Okay.
This function allows you to check the database archive status, but it doesn't properly validate the input.
Okay.
So an attacker can send a malicious request to this function with some SQL code injected into it, and that code will then be executed by the database.
And then what could they do with that?
Well, once they have access to the database,
Yeah.
they can do pretty much anything they want.
Okay.
They can read sensitive data, they can modify data, they can even delete data.
Okay, so it's basically game over at that point.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say I'm a company and I'm running
Yeah.
an SAP NetWeaver AS system on an Informix database. What can I do to protect myself from this?
Well, the first thing you need to do is apply the patch.
Okay.
SAP has released a security note,
Right.
number 3550816, that addresses this vulnerability.
Okay, so just go to the SAP website,
Yep.
download the patch, install it, and you're good to go.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
But in addition to patching, you should also restrict access to the vulnerable functions.
Okay.
So one way to do this is to restrict RFC calls to the function group SDBI.
Right.
This function group contains all the functions that interact with the Informix database.
Right.
So by restricting access to this function group,
Boy.
you can prevent attackers from even being able to access the vulnerable functions.
Okay. And
This sounds pretty simple.
it's not too difficult, yeah.
Okay.
Another thing you can do is to implement input validation.
Okay.
So as we talked about before,
Right.
this vulnerability exists because the vulnerable functions don't properly validate the input.
Right.
So you can add some code to these functions
Oh, yeah.
that will check the input and make sure it's valid.
And is that something that I, as a system administrator,
Mm-hmm.
would have to do.
Yeah, you would need to have someone with some coding experience to do this.
Okay.
But it's not too difficult to do.
Okay.
And it's definitely worth the effort. Okay, so patching, restricting access, input validation. Anything else I can do?
Well, one more thing you can do is use parameterized queries.
Okay.
So parameterized queries are a way to separate the data from the SQL code.
Okay.
So instead of injecting the data directly into the SQL query,
Right.
you use placeholders for the data, and then you pass the data separately. This prevents attackers from being able to inject malicious SQL code.
So it's like, I'm saying, like, here's the query I want to run,
Right.
but I'm not going to tell you what the data is yet.
Exactly.
And then later I say, okay, here's the data to plug into that query.
Exactly.
So that way there's no way for the attacker to mess with the query itself.
Right. They can't manipulate the query.
Okay.
They can only manipulate the data,
Yeah.
which is much less dangerous.
Okay.
So parameterized queries are a really good way to protect yourself from SQL injection attacks.
Okay, so we've got patching, restricting access, input validation, parameterized queries. Any other tips?
Well, one more thing I would say is to use a code scanning tool, like Redray's ABFP code scanner.
Okay.
This tool can help you identify vulnerabilities in your code, including SQL injection vulnerabilities, so you can fix them before they're exploited by attackers.
So this is like something that I can run
Yeah.
on my SAP system.
So yeah, you can run it on your entire code base,
Okay.
and it will tell you
Yeah.
where the vulnerabilities
Yes.
are.
And then
Yeah.
hopefully I can fix them.
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay.
But it's a really good way to find vulnerabilities that you might not otherwise find.
Okay.
Because it's automated. It can scan your entire code base much faster than you could do it manually.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about the technical details of this vulnerability, but let's zoom out a little bit.
Sure.
And talk about the bigger picture here. So why is this vulnerability so serious?
Well, this vulnerability is serious because it could potentially allow attackers to completely compromise your SAP system.
Yeah.
They could read all of your data. They could modify your data. They could even delete your data.
When you say compromise the system,
Yeah.
I mean, what does that really mean?
It means they have full control over
Okay.
your system.
Okay, so they could essentially do whatever they want.
Pretty much,
Really?
yeah. They could install malware. They could steal your data. They could even use your system to attack other systems.
Okay, and SAP systems are
Yeah.
pretty critical.
Yeah, they're used by a lot of companies for
Right.
a lot of critical business processes. So if an attacker were to compromise your SAP system,
Yeah.
it could have a major impact on your business.
Okay, so this is something that companies really need to take seriously.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about why it's serious. We've talked about what companies can do to protect themselves. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I would just say that you need to be proactive.
Yeah.
Don't wait until you're attacked to start thinking about security.
Okay.
Take the time to understand the risks and take the steps to mitigate those risks.
Okay, and don't forget, we've got links to all of the resources that we've talked about today in the show notes. So be sure to check those out. And thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time on Vuln Vibes.
Shit.